Hello, everybody. I'm Catherine Croft. I'm the Director of 20th Century Society, and I'm here to welcome you this evening to Joshua Mardell's talk. Huge apologies to anyone who was with us when we tried to run this the first time. And we had all sorts of technical difficulties. Biggest probably apologies due to Josh, who we left in a terrible situation with the stranded from, well, anyway, the whole Zoom thing didn't work at all. But I'm absolutely delighted that he hasn't put him off and he's back to do his lecture properly this time. And we're confident we've got the system sussed this time. Just before I introduce Josh, I wanted to say that for those listening who aren't members of the 20th Century Society, we're a building preservation organisation, the national organisation in the UK for buildings from 1914 onwards. And our main reason to exist is to campaign for the listing and the preservation of the best examples of buildings of our period. Normally we run lots of real life events, tours, and some foreign trips as well. And normally that's actually kind of makes a big contribution to the to our income, enabling us to do our conservation work. So I am asking, if you would be willing to consider making a donation towards our casework after you've heard the lecture tonight. We'd be very grateful, and it would also be lovely if you considered joining if you're not a member already. Okay, so on to the interesting bit. Josh did his, there we are, you can see him, his master's at the Martin Centre in Cambridge, and then went to Zurich to do a PhD. He's been back in England for a while now. He's got a research position with the collections at the Paul Mellon Centre here in London, and he is working on Gavin Stamp, our ex-president's archive there. So very much looking forward to what he, what comes of that project. I think it's an assessment of Gavin's role and influence as an architectural historian, and I think perhaps looking at some of the connections between the worlds of sort of straight architectural history and conservation. Josh is about to go to be an assistant lecturer at the University of York, and he's also been he still is the curator of our Building of the Month thing on the website. And he's been doing a great job of really bringing in lots of new writers and a really interesting mix of buildings. So I'm very grateful to Josh for that, as well as for tonight's lecture, which proves to be something completely different, really, I think. An interesting topic on something that I'm pretty ignorant about, but I'm very anxious to learn more. So I think, Josh, I should hand over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for your introduction. Thank you for everyone who's here for coming, especially those who have come back after the disaster of the last occasion. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. So let's check that this works. Excellent. Okay. So the social theorist and activist Colin Ward claimed in his book Housing, an Anarchist Approach, published by the anarchist publishing house Freedom, the Freedom Press in 1976, that Pat Crooke and John Turner were world authorities in the field of housing in developing countries, broadly speaking. And in the 2005 book, Rethinking Development in Latin America, the Texas-based scholar Peter Ward observed that probably no one did more to reorient our way of looking at urban development and irregular settlement processes than John Turner, Pat Crooke, and other Barefoot architects. So in this presentation, I'm going to analyze, if you like, the seminal influences that helped encourage and initiate the two rather fertile, I think, careers of these two architects, Crook and Turner, who studied together at the AA in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Whereas John Turner is really rather well known, and there's increasing scholarship on Turner, particularly in the field of development planning. And those interested might refer to the work of Katrin Golder-Pongratz or Richard Harris, for example. But his largely unsung, but nevertheless significant friend, Pat Crooke, is significantly unknown, and there isn't really much biographical information on either of them. And on the one hand, my lecture will detail hitherto unknown knowledge on the role of British architects in this area of developing self-help building strategies for the developing world in the post-war period, especially bottom-up approaches. But my angle as well is to link that to the modern movement, most visibly the post-war years of the international congresses of modern architecture known as CIAM. And CIAM was an organization really that brought together leading players across Europe to spread and debate the principles of modern architecture, urbanism, industrial design between 1928 and 1959. And indeed, I will argue that rather than being unrelated to my protagonists' seemingly more urgent and practical concerns, CIAM was in fact one of the key catalysts that steered their paths as practitioners. So let's start with this quotation. So in putting this together, I thought of this word otherism, and this title came to mind here. There's a well-known work by Sandy Wilson, Colin St. John Wilson, who was himself involved in CIAM in a minor capacity, and the other tradition, so-called, that he described was primarily Scandinavian, of course, namely figures like Aalto and Sharoon and Heron. But otherism, if we mean style, is being worked on, for instance, by Alan Powers, meaning a certain traditionalism, historicism, or a continuation of the classical tradition at such a time that modernism was dominant. And with this case study of Crook and Turner, we're looking less at styles as approaches. We might be better placed calling it simply alternative, but it is otherist in that there won't be many conventionally authored buildings to put up on the slide. And John Gold can back me up here. In his book, The Practice of Modernism, he positioned both Crook and Turner as significant 1920s generation modernists, as in they were born in the 1920s, but argued that, quote, the mode of functional analysis and the networks of context established were more important in Crook and Turner's case than conventional architectural skills training and output. So I'm going to start here with these two sketches by Le Corbusier dating to 1956. And at the point that he was sketching these, there was a turning point in CIAM. I'll put these back on the slide in just a moment. And I'll run through a sort of sketch of the CIAM story very briefly. First of all, there were meetings of this organization every few years, at times more frequently than at other times. I've put a few key dates up on the slide. So CIAM's direction was originally set at the first Congress at La Seraing in Switzerland in 1928, and CIAM has often been caricatured in terms of the rigid zoning of cities into four functions: dwelling, work, recreation, and transportation. And this was epitomized by the Athens Charter of 1933, drawn up on board the SS Patrice from Marseille to Athens, which played host to the Congress's fourth Congress, called the Functional City. The Athens Charter itself was never actually codified. And then the post-war CIAM looked different. In short, as demanded by its post-war generation, coordinated by the Dutch architect Jake Bakema, the organization sought a rereading of architecture, a paradigm shift that intended to lead to a new charter, the Charter of Habitat. And at the extraordinary council meeting held at Le Corbusier's office in Paris in May 1952, and in particular at the interim CIAM council meeting held at Sigtuna in Sweden the following month, the concept of habitat was theoretically established. And again, although the Charter of Habitat was never actually produced, the impact of its formation process was again very fertile. And projects at these post-war congresses cast off this objective functionalism, if you will, and in an atmosphere grounded in humanism, and I'm using that as an emotive term, took a renewed interest in the human as subject. Discussions began to pay close attention to the vicissitudes attendant upon an ethnographic study of the divergent forms of habitation. And habitat itself was defined in various ways, and perhaps the most satisfactory definition comes from the architect Peter Smithson, and he described the essence of late CIAM as the growth of another sensibility, a sensibility about cities, human patterns, and collective built forms. So epithets like interrelationships, scales, and community dominated these post-war discussions. The word core was operative in the 1951 Congress at Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire, which was subsequently summarized in the book that you see on the slide, The Heart of the City, subtitled Towards the Humanization of Urban Life, edited by Jacqueline Tywit. Core was generally referring to the city core and the creation of real civic culture. And Alison and Peter Smithson, the architects themselves, showed this well-known diagram at the 9th and 10th Congresses, their urban re-identification grid, about scales of human associations, unraveling from the isolated scale of the individual dwelling and growing in associations to the doorstep, to the street, and really outwards up to the wider city scale conglomerate. And the word cluster joined the rhetoric by the time of the 1956 Congress in Dubrovnik. And cluster was understood by the Smithsons, for example, as a search for meaningful groupings answering patterns of association, movement, able to give identity, responsive to place, topography, and local climate. So basically the post-war years of the organization were really dominated by a rhetoric of cultural responsiveness and climatology. So here are those sketches again, and it's clear in 1956 that one of the founders of CIAM conceived of the mantle being passed on to a new generation who would take forward what has been achieved so far. And these rather poetic annotations give a sense of that shift, which I hope I've interpreted correctly. So on the left-hand side, 1928, it says the first generation declares its program complete. Whilst when the second generation takes over in 1956, that you see in the middle, the old doctrine, it says, is, quote, torn from confusion, unquote. So the action of the new generation was to harmonize the social, the economic, and the technical. Le Corbusier adds in his notes that action results from facts, from a detailed, we might say, Gadesian examination of specific conditions. So the handing over of the new generation would manifest itself, as many of you will know, most famously in the rather zestful CIAM progeny, Team 10, which, having declared CIAM dead in 1959, went its own way. So my focus this evening is on the influence of this late modernistic thinking as debated or voiced at this international organization, CIAM, on the theory and practice of two protagonists who really worked at the periphery of post-war modernism. So what remains of this presentation will have two parts. The first half will offer a summary of Crook and Turner's intellectual position on architecture and the role of the architect in the context of the challenges of post-war development in the developing world. And I'm going to say developing world because it fits into the context that I'm talking about. So that first half will stress the role of network, and it will briefly lay out Crook and Turner's respective careers in the field, identifying key encounters, key actors, and indeed institutions associated with them. And it will draw on some of the better illustrated case studies of their work. And then the second half will return to the realm of CIAM and other factors like the intellectual atmosphere of the architectural association, and consider, if you like, the history of ideas that stimulated these subjects' paths in practice. So, okay, so as a student at the Architectural Association, Turner wrote to the Swiss historian and architectural critic Siegfried Gideon in Zurich in May 1949. Gideon was the Secretary General of CIAM, and Turner described Gideon, subsequently as having been instrumental in opening our eyes to the problem of our time, and in particular, in encouraging us to establish the platform where we can try to define and state our problem in common terms. The letter he wrote made reference to the visit that he'd made to Switzerland shortly before with his friend Pat Crooke. And there they met Gideon and his wife, the art historian, Carola Gideon Weckler, who Turner described as solicitous and slightly alarming. And the connection to Gideon came through Turner's friend, the architect Pafford Keatinge Clay, who was married to Gideon's daughter Verena, and Gideon arranged for them to eat their to earn their keep cherry picking on a farm. And then Turner added in his letter that, and I quote, "It is time to make the necessary contacts with those who are like us, looking for a common direction and for the techniques of coordinated research and action." Along with another friend at the AA, Joseph Reichwert, Turner wanted to form an international and interdisciplinary network of young architects and students. So he had by this time already reached out to many architects across Europe who were looking in a similar direction, like in the UK, the Outlook Tower sociologists. And the Outlook Tower had been developed by Patrick Geddes, the Scottish urban sociologist, if you will, as quote, a place from which people can get a better sense of their surroundings, thereby engendering a sense of local pride. And it continued to have a bearing on post-war architects, as taken up in a literal way, for instance, at the LCC Lansbury estate at Poplar, planned by Arthur Ling, and Ling himself attended that CIAM Congress I mentioned on the heart of the city. Turner and Reichwert also reached out to the Peckham experiment biologists, but there'll be more on Geddes and Peckham momentarily. The exchange with Gideon revealed both the young Turner's holistic approach to architecture, which was allied with this sort of social theory, and also his craving for a student cohort of like-minded theoretical thinkers. So the direct result of Turner's letter was Gideon's reply, which came with an invitation for Turner and Reichwert to attend the CIAM conference at Bergamo later that year. And this might, Gideon suggested, really satisfy their appetite, because their ideas were rather in tune with the reconfigured CIAM. Okay, so this photo shows Crooke. I don't know if you can see my mouse head, but it shows Crook and Turner, the only photo I could find of them together, making an earlier trip to Italy. And this happened to be included in a letter to John Turner's granddaughter, Anna. He kindly gave me this copy. And he's setting off with Crooke to Italy in a bright red Austin Nippy, I'm told, in 1948. And in the background on the right is John Volker, with whom they were studying at the AA. The annotation says, "We had all sorts of adventures in Belgium, where a wheel came off, and in Switzerland, where we ran out of money, and in Italy, where we were nearly caught up in a communist revolution." The cumulative output of Gideon's nurturing proved rich and seminal. As Turner related recently to me, Gideon had been a supportive influence on his and Crooke's architectural thinking, namely on how we ought to be anarchists. So what I'm now going to do is offer a kind of brief trajectory of our architects' careers. Leaving the AA, both Crooke and Turner provided some assistance with the architect and designer Bruce Martin, working on the Hertfordshire County Council Schools programme. And Crooke was also attending the evening classes of Edward Wright at the LCC Central School of Arts and Crafts. As you can see here, Crooke landed his first commission with Andrew Derbyshire, another of his AA colleagues, in 1952, to build a house in Merioneth in Wales for the TV composer Edward Williams. Now, I can't see the, oh yes I can. So on the left-hand side is Pat Crooke, in the middle is Edward Williams, and on the right-hand side is Andrew, later Sir Andrew Derbyshire. And so perhaps fatefully this came to nothing, and in that way, in fact, neither Crooke or Turner really authored any architecture through conventional practice after this point, so far as I'm aware after the mid-1950s. So much more formative, though, was Crooke's time in Milan on a one-year exchange, an AA exchange, with the Italian practice BBPR in between 1954 and 1955. And this was the first of many such exchanges. And he met Hermann Zampa, who was Dean of Architecture at the University of the Andes in Bogota, who would come over to Europe specifically to recruit staff. And he persuaded Crooke to assist with the early development of the university. And soon after, between 1956 and 58, yes, he assisted the building of the family home of the university's secretary, General Franz von Hildebrand. So this is the earliest documented work that I found by Pat Crooke. And this site was in one of the many scattered settlements in the Llanos, or plains area of Colombia, in a hamlet near Villavicencio. And the houses of these settlements were semi-permanent, brought about by the violence of clan rivalries that made rural life hazardous. The new house adopted the vernacular tradition, maintaining a timber structure from newly felled trees on the site, and the use of a palm leaf thatched roof, a method of construction familiar to all Llanos people. And the enclosures consisted of palm wall laths under a mud and straw render. And people lived or live in hammocks slung from the roof rafters, as you can see in the illustration here, which I suppose is by Pat Crooke. And the plan of the house was that of 4 linked pavilions. Let me go to the plan. The plan of the house, these 4 linked pavilions that allowed it to be built up in various stages. And it was a simple, very affordable structure that demanded really nothing more than the established traditions of the area. And Crooke published this in Architectural Design in 1961. And he summarized the house like this. He said, "Living habits, tools, and materials each impose their limits on the construction and determine its form. The result is a common building language spoken by every home and understood by its occupiers as the shape of their lives." Okay, so from 1958, at the Ministry of Public Education in Lima, Crooke worked on a new manual for setting out simple standards for rural school houses before leading a new team called the Technical Aid Service in School Building. And the program experimented with building forms and methods and helped rural dwellers build their own schools while also testing the standards that were set down in the ministry's new manual. And Crooke led this multidisciplinary team comprising of an assistant architect, a civil engineer, an anthropologist, and 2 social workers. And the experiment included both public meetings and a joint development contract between the service team and building committees represented by members of the estancias, the traditional rural estates consisting of families and clans. So in construction terms, Crooke decided to adopt the local vernacular of the region, namely the Puno region, these large sun-dried adobe bricks of damp earth and grass, a technique that was both straightforward and well known to the communities. And for the roofs, the traditional thatch of totora reed, which was the economic staple of the region, was actually rejected by the communities despite its thermal efficiency, introducing an interesting additional consideration. Corrugated iron roofs were an important sign of local prestige, so Crooke and the team thus improved its thermal mass by the installation of an underlay of cane and plaster. And the assembly of roof trusses and purlins and the fixing of the corrugated iron cladding presented new challenges for the community. In climatological terms, the new schoolhouses were to be grouped with existing buildings to form a patio or play space sheltered from the strong prevailing winds. And the high altitude and cold nights meant that main windows were placed to face east to catch the early morning sun, thereby actually heating the rooms in time for the school day. And the methods of construction encouraged a localized and learning approach, and thereby the process was replicable and sustainable while retaining the community's identity and comprehensibility. Something completely different on the slide now, much more familiar. In 1960, Crooke spent a year in the UK doing freelance work, including with Architectural Design magazine. And this included editing a special issue on Sheffield, including a detailed critique of Park Hill, but also Castle Market by his friend Andrew Derbyshire, which was sadly lost to us a few years ago, but I couldn't resist but put it on the slide on the left-hand side. And then for several years in the 1960s, Crooke took a teaching post at the Department of Architecture at the University of Khartoum in Sudan. And among the projects that he led was a village planning and housing exercise in the Blue Nile province, comprising questionnaires of each of the households, land use proposals, and the density analysis to discover and locate the various forms of overcrowding in the villages. In the mid-60s, he began working as a consultant for the International Labour Organization based in Geneva, and by 1967 was living in Ibadan in Western Nigeria. Among other things, he produced a rural road survey, a study of markets in small villages that considered the importance of communications to boost markets and trading. And then in the late 1960s, based in New York, he led a research mission for the United Nations across 16 countries to update information on squatter settlements. And thereafter, he was involved in vocational training in London at the Development Planning Unit and at the Institute for Housing Studies in Rotterdam. So now just quickly looking also at Turner's trajectory, as it were. His path was largely independent of Crooke's, in fact, and starting in the 50s, in the 40s, he conscientiously objected to military conscription in 1946, and thereafter spent a spell of imprisonment at Windsor Green in Birmingham and in Wormwood Scrubs as well, during his tribunal for conscientious objectors. He also worked as an agricultural labourer for the remainder of his conscription and contributed to the Peter Kropotkin-founded anarchist newspaper Freedom. He spent the early 1950s in private practice in the UK, including working for John Willie Poultock before running self-build schemes. And somewhat randomly, perhaps, I've chosen this scheme by Willie Poultock in Cairo, but I haven't yet discovered what projects Turner worked on with him. And then in 1957, he began work as a consultant on numerous projects in Peru, principally providing assistance in squatter settlements, catalyzed initially by the support of Peru's architect president, Fernando Belaunde Terry. So just let me give you one example of his very industrious career. Sort of salient amongst his field projects was his supervision of a housing development in the Lima suburb of Villa Los Angeles, 64-5, which serves here as an example really of the negotiation between his politics and practice. Turner modeled the development on the traditional process of establishing a squatter settlement or barriada, and he took the lead on the early stages of the scheme's design, but in due course left it in the hands of the town cooperative. The project was structured on incremental improvement, whereby the residents had to meet the funding of the houses themselves, but with subsidies to buy the plots in the initial stages and with the provision of basic services. And the precedents for the chosen patterning, as you can see on the left-hand side, this large gridded plot really of clustered housing, filled in, as you can see on the right-hand side, appeared to follow the traditional networked grid structure of the city of Lima, but preempts the central communal green space that is irregular to barriada developments. You can see that in the plan. Turner related, however, that after some years of observation on the procedures of Lima's city dwellers, replicable dimensional modules are actually adopted that people could follow with ease in building their houses, and this was thought to be a hybrid, really hybrid intelligent version of the process that people already used, but the modules allowed the possibility for them to build in ventilation and core services with relative ease. So as you can see in the second photograph, Turner revisited the neighborhood in 1990. He went also with the German architect Hans Harms, and also with cooperative officers, and everyone was quite impressed by how it had developed, noting in particular how well the public areas had been maintained. And I wish I had more photographs for you, but I couldn't get permission. And then later in life, similar to Crooke, Turner took an associateship at the MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies and simultaneously worked at the Institute of Urbanism in Lima. And then from as early as 1973, he resided permanently in the UK, I think, taking teaching roles at the AA, at the DPU, and also at the Centre for Alternatives in Urban Development in Thamesdown in Wiltshire. And thereafter, he enjoyed, as you can see on the slide, this very high-profile career as a writer on the subject of self-help housing. Excuse me while I have some water. So how might we define something of a mutual project between Crooke and Turner? Well, let's go first of all to the anarchist and designer Norman Potter, who was actually close to Crooke and Turner at the AA. And he remembered them, quote, considering how not to be architects, unquote. If the more conventional options open for British architects in the early 50s were public housing and buildings for public service, Potter alluded to this alternative approach that Crooke and Turner followed, namely, quote, to ally oneself with a do-it-yourself anti-professional working stance, architecture without architects, or with architects as enablers, advisors, and technical consultants. Crooke and Turner self-identified as anarchists. We were horrified by the collectivist society, Turner said. There was a constant debate and discussion, but we didn't do much. And the anti-professionalism they exhibited may also have been owing to a sort of professional neurosis, a sense of paralysis in the face of the assumed and somewhat Western-centered limitations of the very corpora of modern architecture. It's useful to consider this in reference to the quote on the slide from 1963. As those speaking for the dwellers themselves, they said, "It is terrible and too common to hear the complaint, Mr. Engineer or Architect, if only you had helped us when we most needed your knowledge." So anarchistic then would manifest itself in Crooke and Turner's case through an approach to the improvement of the problems of rapid industrialization and uncontrolled urban settlements in the developing world. They shared a belief in community-based housing and local development action, with varying degrees of support from governmental or other external agencies. They believed there were considerable benefits in respecting already existing craft skills and local construction economies, and therefore sought a removal of this government bias towards design and minimum standards as a solution. So, in short, as a way of improving conditions at a time of mass reconstruction, Crooke and Turner sought their own paradigm shift away from the government as financer and builder to one of the government's role as promoter and coordinator of all available agents and resources. So at the root of their polemic was a desire for increased autonomy in housing. That is, they said, the opportunity to do for oneself what one is able to do. By way of a final case study, one means of concretizing the architects' shared project is the example of their housing relief work in Arequipa west of Lima. Funding for new housing was made available following a devastating earthquake in 1958. Earthquakes are quite common in Peru as the country is located in a seismic zone. Both Crooke and Turner were involved in reconstruction there that included establishing a new Pueblo Joven, a Peruvian shanty town, as there were many injured or killed, and there were some 10,000 dwellings that were lost. Now, indicative of the pair's principles, because Crooke came along from Bogota and helped Turner, Turner reflected on these efforts in a later interview with Roberto Chavez at the World Bank, which I think sums up his work rather nicely. He said that we knew the mayor wanted to spend some of the money on housing the earthquake victims. Not a good idea, as so few would be helped. So we suggested a self-build scheme. We could double the number that way. The mayor said, go ahead. And that was my first really useful experience of working at the grassroots. Once we got the project going, we soon realized that our professional assumptions of design, construction, and managerial superiority were exaggerated. We soon learned that we needed our supposed clients' own knowledge and the skills of local builders, and how badly our own bright ideas ignored their realities. A further joint milestone in the architects' careers came several years later when Crook and Turner jointly guest edited an issue of Architectural Design. And Kenneth Frampton remembered them as exotic visitors in the editorial offices with their direct experience of spontaneous housing in Latin America that was featured as this special by Monica Pidgeon. And the issue was titled, as you can see, Dwelling Resources in Latin America, and it described the problems that faced South American countries in the field of housing. Problems made daily more acute by population increases and movements, causing an urban explosion whose only precedent, they claimed, was that suffered by Europe in the second half of the 19th century. The AD issue also propagated, in rather limpid terms, the Barriadas housing philosophies, if you like, of Crook and Turner to an audience of architects at home in the UK. And the catalyst for this special was an article in the Sunday Times Colour Supplement that published a bleeding heart view of the Barriadas, which Turner and Sir Berkeley Gage, British ambassador to Peru, sought to challenge. And the publication, as Turner recalled, was owing to Pidgeon's irresistible support. She swept me into writing my first essays on housing after a tour of the Barriadas of Lima, which we contemplated together while standing on the ruined Inca citadel of Pachacamac. And critically, the issue's positive representation of city builders in urbanizing countries led to a conference in Pittsburgh, which shifted UN policy on the types of housing schemes that it would support. A mass housing approach was finally viewed as counterproductive. And George Movshon, who was the United Nations TV commissioner, also made the connected documentary A Roof of My Own in 1964. I was meant to put the link in the Zoom thing, but I'll do it in a moment. You can watch it for free and learn much more than I've been able to tell you in this presentation about the reality of the Barriadas of Lima. And the AD issue also set the intellectual ground for Turner's own, what might be called his manifesto, Freedom to Build in 1972, which is particularly well known now, in fact. But such a move into publication, as Colin Ward recalled, was reluctantly wrung out of Turner by the admonition of Ivan Illich, the Roman Catholic priest and philosopher and social critic, who worried that Turner was burying his ideas under a lot of Peruvian mud bricks. Okay, this is a shorter second half. Okay, so Crook and Turner's diverse careers were of course also conditioned by ideas and opportunities at their school at the AA. And most illuminating, I think, in perceiving the fecundity of ideas at the school is Crook's thesis project, co-authored with Andrew Derbyshire and John Volker, 1950 to 51, and shown at CIAM 9 in Aix-en-Provence in 53. Supervised by studio tutors Erno Goldfinger and Ronald Jenkins, it was called Zone, a sustainable city region. And it was devised essentially as a micro-region, both rural and urban, which set out to contain the full spectrum of different ways in which it was possible to live. And as you can see in the drawing, the central zone comprised in fact 60,000 people out of a total population of an envisaged 72,000, and this was divided quantitatively into legible groups extending from the individual and family unit outwards to the city as a whole, and it mirrored the Smithson's smaller scale hierarchies of association projects that we've seen. But zone, in fact, was actually modelled on Stevenage, the first of the new towns designated in 1946. And an alternative scheme for Stevenage had already been prepared the year before zone in another one of these AA group thesis projects by Bill Howell, Jill Sarson, John Killick, Stephen McFarlane, and Hugh Morris, which was shown at the CIAM 8 conference in nearby Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire in 1951. So there was at this time, perhaps predictably enough, a strong reaction among younger architects against the new towns, especially as experimental work was hardened, like Lubetkin's rather ill-fated Peter Lee, and experimental work discouraged, bureaucracy hardened. And Pat Crooke actually reflected on this later, and I'm sorry this sounds quite heretical in a 20th century lecture, but he said that 60 years after Zone, I see it as a polemic The best way for students to think and learn while wrecking as many apple carts as possible. In our case, the smug and timid thinking that produced the post-war new towns. In the following years, my own life veered away from these matters. A succession of events led me into a particular field, namely the informally explosive growth of towns and cities under staggering rates of migration in developing countries. And here's another drawing of the Zone project. It could well be Crooke himself, who I understand was the artist of the group. And it bears mentioning that other Zone authors that I mentioned, Volker and Andrew Derbyshire, who might be familiar to some of you, went on to pursue community-oriented practices in the UK, at least initially. Derbyshire was keen early on to apply the principles for social structuring that he'd been keen on at the AA. Similar to Arthur Korn, the German emigre architect planner and also a communist sympathizer, was encouraging in his teaching at the time. And it could be said that this ultimately grounded the spatial patterning of key projects by Andrew Derbyshire, like schools in the West Riding of Yorkshire and also the University of York. As for John Volker, well, his name is perhaps better known because he was actually one of the members of the late CIAM avant-garde, a member of Team 10. But to the dismay of Team 10, to the dismay of the Smithsons, to the bafflement of James Stirling, he set up this quiet rural practice in Kent. And much of the work that he carried out was on agricultural buildings enabled by grants from the Ministry of Agriculture, simply to help farmers improve the efficiency of their buildings and help really redress rural poverty in that part of England. And you can see Volker on the top row at the back with his two kids and Anne Volker at the end in the Ashford sheep market that he designed in 1964. In scale and humility, Volker's practice was, I think, perhaps not too far away from the engagements of Crook and Turner, echoing, for instance, Turner's supervision of a program of electrification in Lima's shanty towns in 1963. 4 British architect volunteers were sent out by the voluntary service overseas, installing mains electricity in the permanent dwellings within the barriadas. An anarchistic approach to housing can be contextualized within the more general anarchist atmosphere of the AA since its inception in 1847, where students tired of the articled pupillage system took architectural education into their own hands. Moving forward to the 1950s, it's unsurprising that the AA principal, Robert Furneaux Jordan, was involved with radical left-wing politics at the time of Crook and Turner's schooling, and there were other influential teachers at the time, like Otto Königsberger and Walter Siegel. Königsberger headed the Department of Development and Tropical Studies from 1953, and he was among the leading pioneers in the direction of urban development planning and also self-help in tropical climates. The economic realities of developing countries made mechanical air conditioning unaffordable, and architects were looking to the climatic conditions as a form giver in itself, achieved through research in the field. And Königsberger was also the consultant for the Smithsons' climate responsive work of the 1960s, including their unbuilt tropical projects, the British Embassy in Brasilia, 1964, and the Kuwait Mat building. Walter Siegel was on the staff proselytizing his self-build methods and had undertaken studies of vernacular architecture in Ibiza, Mallorca, and Egypt. Neither of our subjects, in fact, used the Siegel method, but they both idolized him. And here's a house built using the Siegel method in 1981 near Sydenham, not far from me. And in this domestic context, the work was also based on very simple construction methods, like concrete in a bucket as the initial pod, very simple that it could even be used on uneven ground. And furthermore, on the left-hand side of the slide, one sees parallels in Zone, as Andrew Derbyshire recalled. On the human and social dimension, we provided for do-it-yourself home builders to put their own dwellings together within the megastructure, buying what they needed as a prefabricated kit of parts. Turner also identified a long-rooted genealogy with William Morris, and his grandfather worked with him, no less, and May Morris was his mother's godmother. So this put him in touch, no less, he recalled, with a bottom-up orientation to the importance of regenerating and maintaining control over production at the local level, the vernacular roots of genuine culture. Furthermore was the strength of interest of Turner in Patrick Geddes, and he noted his debt to Geddes's work, both on slums and on popular housing in Indore in India, that sought to use the existing community structures and built fabric of slum areas as a base for new development rather than replacement. And he linked this really to his future thinking. He explained that Geddes's method was to involve himself as closely as he could with all the people concerned, especially with those who were suffering most from the consequences of urban dysfunctions and blight. The possibilities for a young and inexperienced professional to get as involved in such a thoroughly institutionalized country as the UK seemed remote. And on the slide, the previous slide, sorry, is that anthology put together by Jacqueline Tyward of Geddes's writing on India during his time there in the early 20th century, I think during the First World War and slightly after. And Turner also added that through Geddes's work, he learned to think in terms of the relationships between man and his environment, and that Geddes seemed much more relevant than Le Corbusier or CIAM. But an interest in Geddes also consumed a lot of thinking that took place at the post-war meetings of CIAM. And here, different types of dwelling are shown in this very famous diagram of the Geddes Valley section in relationship to their habitat in this manuscript version of the Team 10 primer of 1968. Furthermore, I'm conscious of the time, furthermore, there was the remarkable fecundity of the Architectural Association's student publications. Plan magazine, for example, one of the mechanisms for introducing modernism to the school, and Crook and Turner were among the editors of the 6th and 7th issues, as you can see here, and the latter contained an article on the Peckham Health Centre, designed by Owen Williams in 1935. And these are the tracings for the issue drawn by Stephen Macfarlane, the Bristol architect. And on the one hand, it was established as a fully autonomous members club in which the patients made decisions about their own medical treatment, echoing, we might say, Crook and Turner's advocacy for freely federated housing in developing countries. On the other hand, the Peckham sociologists, George Williamson and Innes Pearce, viewed society in line with Geddes as an evolving organism, an opportunity to study community through all its stages of growth rather than just as an accomplished fact. On the Peckham biologists, Turner recalled that their work made a deep impression, consolidating our holistic approach to architecture and local development. Its self-organization was actually replaced by the boost of the welfare state, but it should be considered a valid alternative model. And then furthermore, it was Crooke who illustrated this Corbusian modular monkey in plan that was meant, according to Stephen Macfarlane, as an amusing contribution on our large pin-up board used to post ideas for the magazine. The zone authors had adopted the modular, of course, to determine the proportions of the buildings at all scales in the zone scheme. I don't know if Crooke ever found out, but it was actually included in the 2nd edition of Le Corbusier's modular, and he called it a topsy-turvy modular man, which is not without savour. And Crooke simply turned the proportional scale for the modular man upside down. So the very last segment of my lecture will return to Mars and CIAM and look more specifically at its relevance or lack of to Crook and Turner. Although Crooke displayed zone at CIAM 9 in Aix-en-Provence, he was keen to distance himself from the organization. In an undated critique of the organization from around this period, he wrote really of his frustration with rationalist planning, the CIAM emphasis on theory over action, and he thought that CIAM should replace these abstract and diagrammatic proposals with more tangible things, with physical reconstruction efforts. And the needs and values of communities, he argued, were constant, whereas their shape and form were always variable. And this is one characteristic segment from Crooke's Jeremiad. He says a paragraph from the Athens Charter of 1933 illustrates clearly the view of urbanism of that time. Under the heading recreation, it states that it should be required that the general sanitation of 2 densely populated districts be improved by the raising of slums and other buildings, the cleared sites to be devoted to recreational purposes. This is a simple and clear proposal, cutting like a surgeon's knife into a situation in the interests of hygiene and fresh air, of man's material well-being, but it's a proposal from outside making no valuation of the slum area as a community. And Crooke was also involved to a greater or lesser extent in the activities of the Mars Group, which essentially acted later on as the British branch of CIAM, and who often held their meetings at the AA. Particularly notable is a meeting in the spring of 1954, in which the Smithsons, Volker, Ove Arup, Jacqueline Tyrwood and Erno Goldfinger joined Crooke in a discussion centered on finding a replacement to the Athens Charter. Crooke provided a significant voice to these discussions, arguing that the framework should emphasize the skill of the planner in locating the realities of urbanism in a coherent scale, rather than a series of contradictions. And along with other figures, he also propagated the need for a time dimension, promoting a view of urbanism in which time is a creative factor in the shape and setting of daily human life. And this view was echoed by Bernard Rudowski, who rejected this definitive solution to housing problems that was perhaps held by many modernist architects, which he said was born of illuminist positivist thinking and faith in the constancy of human desires. And his exhibition at MoMA, as you see on the slide, is particularly well known. Turner's story is very different. He attended the Hoddesdon and Bergamo Congresses, and this proved significant because the French architect Michel Ecochard was there promoting his work on the rebuilding of bidonvilles or squatter settlements. Also notable the attendance of Giancarlo De Carlo, who later authored influential work on participatory architecture. Of still greater value, I'm coming to an end now, of still greater value was Turner's attendance at the CIAM Summer School in Venice in 1950, where he met the Peruvian architect planner Eduardo Naira, who had studied urban planning in Liverpool. He was an advisor of the Peruvian government's consulting group launched to identify the problems of the housing crisis and propose solutions. And he was responsible for Turner moving to work in Peru 6 years after their meeting. He reflected in 1972 how he jumped to the opportunity offered by Naira, whom he said understood popular or community action in the way that Morris did, as a support for genuine community-based social action. I felt that if I could get out from among the underbrush of technological innovations and intellectual formulations and into the much simpler situation described by Naira, I might be able to see my way. So coming to a conclusion, in his discussion of the founding fathers of the modern movement, Norman Potter described Geddes as a synthesizer of ideas and a social activist, much concerned with user participation, in which regard it must be clear that Turner or Crooke stand within the tradition of concern of the modern movement and not outside of it. Crook and Turner, after all, in industrialized non-Western contexts, had commodity shortages, housing, labor, materials in common with their UK peers, while experiencing a compatible growth of state intervention in architecture. And furthermore, they shared this heroic notion of the architect as public servant in common with many fellow students who had left the AA eager to build the welfare state in the UK. One could do both. Leo de Silas had worked on tropical architectural projects in West Africa, for example, while the community architectural projects of Max Locke, whether Hartlepool or Basra, broached both of these spheres. And Crook and Turner can also be seen as part of a broader coalition, really, with a common project that includes people like the late Paul Oliver, who joined the AA from rehousing work in Ghana in 1955, the Dutch architect John Hebreken, whose work, as you see on the slide, supports an alternative to mass housing, was in direct opposition to Dutch welfare state housing projects. And later, Nabil Hamdi, who graduated from the AA as late as 1968 and authored Housing Without Houses in 1991. So it's clear that Crook and Turner worked quite within the late CIAM tradition. Advocacy, planning, self-build, user participation were all on that agenda. And they were energetically, if rather modestly, engaged in its mission towards a rooted, socially cohesive model of living. CIAM's position at the interface of culture, politics, and internationalism no less significantly meant that they could meet a network of like-minded thinkers, prompting new paths and directions. Moreover, they were united by shared conceptual frameworks fostered by the ideological shifts at late CIAM and in gestation at the AA that offered intellectual inspiration, but also a certain validation for their own barefoot so-called approaches. So in the context of the specificities demanded by conditions in the developing world, Crook and Turner turned the rigid appellation modern architect on its head. Such was redefined by Crook in 1962 as a teacher and builder, as well as a designer, whose work is sanctioned by the confidence and cooperative of the local people, unquote. So in this capacity, as modern architects, Crook and Turner sought to safeguard people's freedoms to budget their own resources and shape their own environments. Oh, and on the slide is Andrew Derbyshire, Pat Crooke, and John Ollis, unfortunately not John Turner, in the AA at Christmas, circa 1950. I'm not sure. Working on Zone, I think. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Lovely, thank you very much. That was incredibly wide-ranging and thought-provoking. I don't know whether anyone has any questions from the audience. If you would like to put them in either the chat or the Q&A, I'm very happy to read them out and ask Josh if he's willing to have a go at answering them. While we're just seeing whether people have got the time or have got any questions they want to do like that. Josh, I mean, it looks as though you've spent a huge amount of time looking at all sorts of archives. Could you tell us where you've been digging up all this stuff?
Well, I was lucky to be in touch with Pat Crooke before he passed away in 2018, albeit he had very little interest in CIAM. So I benefited from interviews from him. Weirdly enough, I found what I described as his CIAM Jeremiad in the papers of John Volker in Wales. But also I've had the advantage of looking through all different sort of scattered remnants of papers surrounding this effort towards a charter of habitat that never materialized, especially the Siegfried Gideon papers and CIAM papers.
We're there in Zurich, aren't they?
At the archive of the Institute of History and Theory of Architecture at ETH, my alma mater, yeah. Mars Group papers as well, particularly those in the collections of Jacqueline Tyrwood and over Arab, because I think most of the Mars stuff out of those private collections was burnt or lost to us in a fire, I think. Student projects at the AA archives as well, and then that's all I've actually looked at, but there's lots of stuff in Harvard, like the Smithson's papers, and yeah, so lots of stuff, but there's a hell of a lot more that could be looked at.
Yeah. I thought your slides were lovely. I mean, and had that real sense of someone wading through an archive and coming up with all sorts of pertinent things and pulling them together. We have got one question. It says, oh, not a question, but a note for the future. Norman Potter's book, What is Designer? Doesn't have a question mark in the title. Oh, right. Potter was stating a position. There we are.
Oh, okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. I was probably just self-correcting. No.
Good. Well, I mean, I think, you know,
could I just, sorry to interrupt, but we have another question.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, from the Q&A, sorry.
Yes, we were looking at it a little bit. I'll leave you to do it now.
Okay. Yes, Bethany says, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. Please, can you tell me more about who was John Willie Poltock?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, it's one of the few British architects, perhaps. Yeah, so I don't really know. I mean, I don't know what Turner did for him. That's why I put up that screen in Cairo, but he did a lot of projects in Kent. I assume he might have been Kent based. He has his papers at the Kent History Centre. There are lots of projects there. Most famously a school in Chislehurst for boys. And the main source I could find on him, I'm afraid, was Reba Pix. There's also a Roman Catholic school in Canterbury. So that's all I know. And I don't know whether he has anything much to do with influencing Turner's career.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think because we move into a world with the proposed new planning legislation where architects are increasingly distanced from the production of housing, how local communities and builders will get involved and contribute to what our future cities looks like is, it's a very changing, we're at a changing moment, and I think maybe looking at architects like this and what they've done in the past could be really useful for informing that sort of discussion.
Yes, is there a new book on Walter Seagull issued by the 20th Century Society?
There is imminently, but not quite yet.
Okay, all right, sorry. I thought so. Looking forward to it.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean, well, oh, have we got another? No, we haven't. We've got another. Lots of observations, which I think I will leave you, Josh, to absorb. And I mean, people show kind of interest and appreciation and engagement rather than actually producing specific questions. Okay, so thank you once again, and I'm really, really glad it went smoothly this time, and enormously grateful. And obviously, we wish you all the best in your when you go to York, and we very much hope that you will stay closely in touch with us. I mean, we'll be doing the building of the month, I hope, but I'm particularly intrigued to see what you make of Gavin's archive. I'm sure that will be fascinating.
Okay, thanks.
Hope to have you back to talk about that in due course.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Oh, before we finally log off, I should just say that next week we have the first lecture in our autumn lecture series, which is my colleague Claire Price, who's head of casework for 20th century. She's going to talk about British churches in the interwar period. She's actually doing a PhD at Oxford at the moment on that, and it'll be my first opportunity to really get to grips with what she's doing for her PhD. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So I hope to see many of you then. That's this Thursday, as opposed to that night being Tuesday. I've been totally thrown by us having a Tuesday lecture, Josh. Okay, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.